first time to the One Young World stage to Ellie Goulding.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am beyond flattered and tremendously humbled to be appointed as a One Young World Councillor this year. It's also such a joy to follow one of my all-time heroes, Dr. Jane Goodall, up here on stage. Jane empowers generation after generation with the emotional and ecological literacy to make a true difference. I can only say how grateful I am, Jane, wherever you are now, that my time on this planet coincides with yours. And yes, Tarzan did miss out, but actually, who could ever be good enough for you? The same goes for all of you One Young Earth delegates and ambassadors, One Young World. I want to thank you for devoting so much of your energy to the climate emergency, species loss, social injustice, and gender inequality. I want to thank you for applying your phenomenal brainpower and creativity to unravel the mess left by previous generations. Your actions as young leaders make me more determined, not only to play my part, but to be part of the winning team. Today, I'm also representing Sustainable Development Goal 13 on climate action. And like you, I'm very serious about winning this. I don't want to minimize the task ahead or the threats we face, but I also believe the seemingly impossible can become possible very quickly. For example, look at the speed with which a movement can grow. Over the last 12 months, the clear-eyed focus of young people and their willingness to dedicate their Fridays to climate action has created an unstoppable force of change. I have to pinch myself to remember that when I first met Greta Thunberg at the makeshift Arctic base camp at Davos last year, the school climate strikes were a relatively recent phenomenon. It is clear the climate emergency is not a side issue or a point that will fade from view. Climate emergency is the era that we now inhabit. There are many people praying for the day we all shut up and stop talking about it, and they're going to be very disappointed. Thank you. It forms the backdrop to our lives, actually, a constant soundtrack that will only become louder. It is not going to go away. We can only go forwards and faster. There needs to be only one destination: effective climate action. But to get there, we must be able to seize and control the narrative. And this is incredibly important. There are still so many hearts and minds that need to be won. Meanwhile, there are far too many counter-narratives telling people that the science is overblown or incorrect. The main message of those false stories is that we can carry on as we are, bankrolled by fossil fuels and poverty elsewhere. This is the narrative that leads to disaster. Those content to sit and roll the dice on a planetary collapse are hard to love. But they are also mystifying. Who really wants to let things play out as they are? This is simply not me, and I know it's none of you either. From a very early age, I have been motivated by anger about injustice. When I used to see homeless people as a young person growing up in Herefordshire, in my community, I immediately wanted to know why, and this was very, very young. As I found out more, I wanted to know where all the solutions were. Then I wanted to know why discomfort and hardship had been normalized, and then we'd all just kind of sit back and let things happen. In recent years, I found myself asking similar questions about surging carbon emissions, species loss, and the tangled web of complacency that breeds inaction. I found my fans, many of whom are very young, had the same questions. They were and are still struggling to get answers from parents and schools. And to my initial horror, they began asking me. I can't tell you how strange I felt about this. I grew up in rural Hereford on the border between England and Wales. I lived in a very small house, in a small community, but a big landscape. To get anywhere, we did have to walk through fields. And I got to know these fields and all the wildlife around me. I fell in love with that landscape. I've always been passionate that other kids get the chance to be in nature and experience their local environment the way I did. For me, it instilled a need to protect this landscape and others. Hearing that other young people were struggling to get access on information on the natural world and the emerging reality of the climate emergency made me realize I needed to step up and talk about my private love of the planet. You could say at some point I became an environmental activist. 3 years ago, I became a UN Environment Ambassador. In that role, I've traveled to areas on the front line of climate change. I've met incredible people across the world who are responding to the climate emergency. And I've become obsessed with guarding nature's greatest assets, the rainforests and the oceans, our greatest carbon sinks. From my fans, I get my mandate to speak out. Many are young and stepping into adulthood with big ambitions for their future. For this reason, I'm determined that our collective climate ambitions should be stated clearly and passionately at any possible opportunity. And that's why I'm here today. Because although stages are my home from home, I wouldn't go that far, I still get terrible stage fright. I do prefer to be singing and entertaining than giving speeches, and that's the truth. In fact, this moment right now lifts me very far out of my comfort zone. And what moves me even further out is the idea of giving you brilliant people advice. The only thing I can really offer you in my role as One Young World Councillor is my unwavering support, which you have wholeheartedly. But because I've been asked to speak here today, I'm going to finish with some observations, which feels like something a councillor should do. I repeat, this is definitely not advice. My first observation, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate, is that I feel as though I'm not doing enough. When I'm not doing something that directly addresses homelessness or the climate emergency, I feel really guilty. At first, I worried that fear and guilt would really consume me and make me less impactful. And now I realize these feelings are what we might expect in the era of a climate emergency. I recently heard a long-standing campaigner put it this way: what do you call someone who feels no guilt? As the answer is a psychopath, I think I should probably be glad I do feel guilt and use that as a motivating force. Another thing I've become acutely aware of is the power of songs to communicate messages. I think this is an incredibly important lesson to remember when we're trying to tell our stories about Earth. I'm not suggesting we all start writing songs directly about burning rainforests and melting glaciers, but that we understand that it is as important to connect on a human level as it is to tell the facts. Songs, for me, contain pockets of emotion, and they are carriers of empathy. They give us an emotional workout, whether that be a moment of living our best lives or feeling an absolute kinship with someone who's in emotional pain. This type of connection for me is the point and the power of music. While we have a surfeit of material goods that urgently need to be addressed, we have a deficit of empathy and kindness and understanding. So I guess I want to say, let's produce more. Empathy, kindness, and understanding are also emissions-free. Sorry, that's really geeky, that one. Thirdly, we are sitting on the greatest story that has ever been told. Because when we tell stories about a future delinked from a fossil fuel economy where life chances are not dictated by geography, imagine how powerful that will be. Because change needn't be complicated and alienating. It needn't be full of tech jargon or long-winded. I was reminded recently hearing someone pitch an amazing, carbon-busting, affordable, cheap way of sucking emissions out of the air that simply can be beautiful. Because it transpired that the emissions-defying, Paris-compliant innovation being pitched was in fact a common or garden tree, and billions are being planted across the globe. So that was also a bit my geeky side. Finally, I really want to say that staying positive is really, really crucial. And I know it's really hard, trust me. It's been proven time and time again that defeatism is the enemy of productivity. And we certainly know we have a lot to get done. But why not go beyond this? The greatest ally and asset for leaders of change like you is radical hope. I think so many of you already carry radical hope in everything you do. This is extraordinary, because in the face of reality of climate emergency, you dare to dream and you still dream big. You push for a future where you will move beyond what we have now. You have the courage to imagine a future that puts our beautiful planet first and protects every living species equally. But such radical hope provokes a predictable backlash. Perhaps you've already experienced it. The argument goes like this: how dare you talk of a climate emergency when you once used an electric toothbrush, accepted a lift in a car, or went on holiday? Over the past few months, the backlash grows ever uglier. I'm just being honest, employed to try and hush up school kids through to enlightened business leaders. This argument is not only ugly to me, it's outrageous. Feel free to point out that the only reason you are put in this position is because previous generations have failed to act. Instead of acting, they have backed and reinforced an infrastructure that makes hypocrites of us all. Meanwhile, their narrative does suck. It compels us to do nothing, wait for collapse and abandon all hope. It is by definition a hopeless, defeatist, impossible narrative. But you gathered here under the One Young World umbrella offer the polar opposite. Your hope is courageous, creative, and necessary. Your narrative is a positive and logical response to the science and evidence. It is also the strategy most likely to win. And I humbly request that you never let anybody tell you otherwise. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm so delighted to be on your side, which is the winning side. Thank you.
Thank you.